Anatoly Moskvin was born in the Soviet-Russian locality of Gorky, today known as Nizhny Novgorod. He was born in 1966 to parents Yuri Fedorovich and Elvira Alexandrovna. His upbringing was far from easy. Whilst he was in 3rd grade, he returned home one day covered in bruises he had received whilst being raped by an unknown man. It's unclear whether or not he told this story to his parents as a child, but they had noted that something was wrong in his character. However, they had also known from an early age that he was intelligent, and as stalwart Soviets, they simply chalked his social awkwardness and difficulty making friends up to this fact, though they did try to question him on his behaviour. Whenever they brought it up, he reacted aggressively, and so instead, they left him to his devices. He was academically successful, always at the top of his class, but often bullied and ostracised at school, struggling to create social relationships. Instead, he squirreled himself away and spent every penny he came across on books, whilst independently teaching himself languages. If this upbringing had so far managed to not scar the young Moskvin, it was an incident that occurred on March 4th, 1979 that would do the job comprehensively. In later life, he referred to it as a turning point for him, igniting an interest in both the occult and the cemeteries he would later meticulously study, almost on a level of pilgrimage. Aged 12 and attending School 184, Moskvin was out collecting waste paper with the rest of his class. In Soviet Russia, recycling was organised by the government, and schools held compulsory competitions for waste paper collection. Framed as they were in a competitive setting, the pupils would often find themselves in places that they perhaps should not have been, trying to outdo their classmates. And so it was that Moskvin found himself in the yard of a stranger. The occupants of the house were not having a very usual day, however, and clocking the 24 adult figures wearing black robes, holding burning candles over a coffin, and singing in a foreign language, he knew that perhaps this time he had overstepped his boundaries. As he backed out of the yard and went to take off, one of the occupants that had seen him grabbed hold of his shoulder, insisting to him that he should come and kiss the face of the dead child who lay in the coffin. The child was a young girl named Natasha Petrova. Aged 11, she had grabbed for a towel as she stepped out of the bath and instead made contact with a loose electrical cable, electrifying herself and dying instantly. Today was her funeral, though from the scene in front of him, Moskvin knew that this was no ordinary affair. He refused to kiss the girl, though the parents would not hear of it. He began to cry, sensing the futility of the situation. He had begged to be let go, but had won no favour, and so, realising the hopelessness of the situation, he approached the body in the coffin. A woman, apparently the mother of the deceased, gave me a large Hungarian apple and kissed my forehead. She led me to the coffin and promised me a great deal of candy, oranges and money. She told me to kiss the deceased. I burst into tears and begged her to let go, but the sectarians insisted. Everyone again sang prayers in a language I did not understand, and one of the adults drew my head to the waxy forehead of the girl in a lace cap. I had no choice but to kiss where I was ordered. Moskvin kissed the lifeless girl 3 times on the forehead. 2 copper rings were produced, and he was instructed to place one onto the finger of the girl and to wear the second himself. He was then awarded a basket of fruit and a small sum of rubles for his troubles and let free into the street, though not before he was told not to tell anyone of what had taken place for at least 40 days. On the corner of the street, Moskvin threw the fruit into the snow and then went to spend the money he had been given on a book about animals. After the event, he began having strange dreams of the dead girl who would visit him nightly. Natasha had come to him, she explained, to insist that he learn black magic from her. He refused this outright, though Natasha was anything if not persistent. She visited him in his dreams every night until he eventually went back to her village, which stopped the visitations for a time. Shortly after he returned home, however, the dreams started again. He told his parents about Natasha, and finally they decided to seek medical advice for their troubled son. The doctor, however, concluded that Moskvin was merely transitioning into puberty and prescribed him a course of valerian, a herbal sedative commonly taken to aid in sleep and relaxation. After a full year of these nightly visits, Natasha finally drew weary of Moskvin's rebutals. Instead, she tried a different tact, suggesting a course of action that Moskvin could take to pass this burden on to another. He carried out a simple ceremony that she had described to him, using a tooth he obtained from a classmate as a magical component in the ritual. This ended in success, and Natasha never visited him again, though her presence in his life would have a profound effect on him as an adult. He would visit the site of her grave at Krasnaya Etna whenever he was in the Leninsky district of Nizhny Novgorod. This event too opened his eyes to the strange world of the occult, which he would soon find a deep interest in. The whole affair also kick-started his interest in cemeteries, which he said attracted him like a magnet. As a university student, Moskvin studied in the philological faculty of Moscow State University. He had since a young age been interested in languages, and from his independent studies now spoke a staggering 13 different languages. Taking advantage of the freedom of student life, Moskvin joined the Society of Luciferians, a theistic branch of Luciferianism that embraced many concepts of the left-hand path. He took part in rituals involving dead animals, passed a test to become a black magic user, and vowed celibacy and abstinence from drinking and smoking. Now he found that he regretted his earlier shunning of Natasha, though he still found the story of her visits to be useful. In the era of perestroika, I decided to study magic. Knowledgeable people did not refuse to teach me after I told them the story of my marriage to Natasha. In contrast to this occult path in his life, by day Moskvin wrote his thesis for the Department of German and Celtic Philology, and upon graduation began teaching Celtology at Nizhny Novgorod University. He published 2 Russian to English dictionaries, as well as a dictionary of foreign words and a dictionary of school phraseology aimed at school-aged children. His colleagues found him to be kind, punctual, and a genius. This came at a certain social price, however, and many regarded him to be somewhat eccentric, whilst others found him straight difficult to get along with. Following several disagreements with some of the staff at the university, he left this position, instead focusing on writing and tutoring. His mother later explained how he enjoyed communicating with the children, and he was popular as a tutor, teaching predominantly languages, though he also tutored various other subjects from history to literature. In 2003, Moskvin met Yulia Granova, a young woman whom he much admired. Yulia was spiritual and concerned with Indian religions, and the pair entered into a non-sexual relationship, with Yulia playing a role somewhat akin to a muse to Moskvin, whilst he continued to write. The relationship satisfied Moskvin's need for socialisation, whilst allowing him to maintain his vows of celibacy, and Yulia was happy enough with the arrangement, having suggested it herself. She wanted a child, however, and it didn't take much convincing for Moskvin to agree, as he had wanted a child of his own for many years already. Given the non-sexual nature of their relationship, Moskvin applied for adoption of a young girl in 2003. By this point, his income was erratic, and he was living hand-to-mouth on the paychecks he received from journalistic work he published in several local papers. Outside of this small wage, he lived at home with his parents, who propped him up financially. His parents didn't hold the same enthusiasm for his plans to adopt, which led to tensions in the family, leaving to Moskvin threatening, "I told my mother that I would be engaged in black magic and get in touch with the spirits of the dead." Used to his eccentric behaviour, she merely told him to do as he pleased. In the end, it all fell to nothing. His application was rejected on the grounds that his earnings were too low, and his relationship with Yulia eventually evaporated. The imminent need for a child appeared to fall to the background. Instead, Moskvin turned his attentions to a new adventure on the roads of Nizhny Novgorod. On July 18, 2005, Moskvin hit the road for the first time as part of a new research venture he had organised, financially assisted by Oleg Ryabov, a well-known Nizhny Novgorod-based historian. The pair planned to publish a book entitled Nizhny Novgorod Necropolis, and for Moskvin's part, He was to journey across the region, documenting cemeteries and unearthing local history along the way. For 3 years, Moskvin travelled across Nizhny Novgorod. He averaged over 30 kilometers per day, most of it undertaken on foot due to the rural nature of many of the areas he visited. The buses would often leave only once per day and rarely held convenient schedules, and many of the roads he travelled were in various states of disrepair anyway. As he walked, he read books. My legs walked on the roads, my eyes walked on the lines. In general, he arrived in the cemeteries by the evenings, and he would spend the remaining daylight hours scraping the moss from old headstones with a chisel, writing the owners' names, dates of life and death, and any other information he could muster into a notebook with a pencil. He slept where he could, though oftentimes his bed was in the stone entrances of the cemetery, a haystack in a field, sawdust piles, or at lucky times, he would find a cemetery with a lodge and use that for shelter. One night in a Muslim cemetery in Sagachsky, he slept inside a coffin that had been kept in preparation for a future burial. The next morning he was awoken by 2 very surprised gravediggers, who fortunately for Moskvin were already drunk and were as startled as himself, which allowed for the situation to be smoothed over with a level of joviality. He never had any problems from police, he noted, as they never toured the graveyards, only the lazy officials who drove their cars to secluded areas to sleep rather than patrol. On the occasions he was stopped and searched, he always showed them his academic research materials and was allowed to continue on his way. He was not always so fortunate with civilians, however, and in 2006, whilst documenting a cemetery in Betalinsky, he was approached by a group of 12 drunk men who were out celebrating a wedding. They accused him of robbery. He pleaded with the men to be taken to police rather than beaten, and when they arrived at the station, the officials smoothed the situation and drove him to the edge of town, warning him not to return. On another occasion, in September of 2006, he was visiting a cemetery in Pavlovo when he was mistaken for a priest by a trio of 2 drunk guys and a drunk woman who were mourning by the grave of their recently deceased daughter. When they asked him to sing with them, he declined, explaining he was no priest, and he turned to leave. The men beat him and robbed him of his money and watch. However, the next day, Moskvin revisited the gravesite, noted the name on the headstone and reported the affair to police, who followed up the lead and promptly arrested the men. Outside of the difficulties the research threw up with drunk locals, the sheer exhaustion of it all took its toll on Moskvin. In 2006, he noted that the weather was unusually rainy throughout the summer, and in 2007, it was unusually hot, leading him to drink from puddles. It was safe to say that the work was exhausting, and Moskvin attributed the exertion of the years he spent trekking across rural landscapes to research the graveyards for greying his hair and thinning his hairline. It wasn't all struggle, however. He noted also the general hospitality of many people who bought him food and drove him between various rural villages free of charge. In the end, it was all for a good cause, he would remind himself. Many records had been lost during the Soviet regime, and Moskvin did not find the reports from newspapers to be trustworthy. Even before the Soviets, he noted that the handwriting and the general poor condition of old documents made the information extracted from them far from trustworthy. It was far better, he insisted, to get out on the roads and do the work for yourself. Between 2005 and 2007, Moskvin visited 752 cemeteries in 35 districts, uncovering the pasts of over 1,000 people that had been thought to be lost to time. Quite aside from the research work for his upcoming book, this pilgrimage held a second, rather more disturbing advantage for Moskvin, one that would overshadow any of his previous works of writing. Between 2006 to 2010, after his research into cemeteries, Moskvin wrote for various papers, including the Nizhny Gorodovsky Rabochki, where he wrote twice monthly pieces on cemeteries and history, and in the Nizhny Novgorod Worker, writing on various historical subjects. Never one to shy away from the taboo, he wrote an article concerning the Mongol-Tatar invasions of Russia between the 13th and 15th centuries, which accused the invaders of raping thousands of women. This drew both criticism from the public, as he found himself accused of extremist activity against the Tatar people, as well as interest to the E Division of the MVD, the Russian Department of Internal Affairs anti-terror outfit. In 2008, Moskvin published a book on the history of the swastika as a solar symbol up until the 19th century. This drew attention upon him once again. This time he came under fire and was accused of being a fascist, once again pricking the ears of the authorities. After the 2011 Domodedovo International Airport terror bombings, Moskvin visited a Muslim cemetery and painted tombstones along with affixing newspaper reports to headstones containing names of the deceased. This had followed a flurry of anti-Muslim activity in the area and desecration of Muslim graves around the region, and prompted the E Division, who had been following him for some time now, to take action. On the 2nd of November 2011, they raided Moskvin's apartment. Rather than extremist materials, however, they found something far, far more disturbing. Inside the apartment, officials found 29 human-sized dolls, dressed in women's clothing and painted with crude makeup. Some of them had music boxes embedded into their chests, allowing them to speak. The scene of these dolls, propped up around Moskvin's room and stored in the garage, would be quite strange enough. However, the dolls held a darker secret. As the E Division began searching and clearing the apartment, they noticed the dolls made a rattling sound when they were picked up and shook. They opened one up and found that stored inside each one was the mummified remains of a human body. Moskvin had been collecting more than just history from the graveyards of Nizhny Novgorod. As the E Division tore through the apartment, they found more and more dolls, 29 in total, all dressed in outfits of paper and cloth and arranged throughout the rooms. They carried each one out of the house to be placed on the back of a truck in front of the gathering crowds of journalists and locals, who watched on in curious disbelief of the stories they heard filtering into the streets through whispers and gossip. The story was too much for papers to resist, and by the next day it blew up nationally, with headlines dubbing Moskvin the puppeteer. Following the arrest, his father was hospitalised, suffering a heart attack. His mother was also hospitalised for a period, blaming her poor health on the shock of their son's arrest. Despite living with the dolls for so long, they held fast to the story that they had no idea what was inside the macabre effigies. They appeared like crude papier-mâché dolls, and in the past, Moskvin had held an interest in Russian dolls, so his parents just assumed it was an extension of that interest. A friend of his parents spoke of their shock in a later interview. The dolls didn't turn up suddenly. Moskvin had built up the collection over 10 years. All of them were kept in his room. There was only one in his parents' rooms, which he named Masha. His parents had no idea. When friends visited, they often remarked on them as works of art, calling them puppets. They just never thought they might contain mummified humans. The only concern his mother had was that at times he would talk to them. "Are you a child?" she would say. "Why do you play with them?" On one New Year's Eve, Moskvin introduced Masha to his aunt, after sitting her at the family table. "This is Masha," he said. "Do not be afraid of her." All of the dolls were found to contain the mummified remains of young girls who had suffered tragic and often violent deaths. Though there are several whose names and details were never released, the reported ages of the deceased range anywhere between 3 and 30 years old. Moskvin stuffed the mummified remains with cloths and rags, dressed them in clothes he found in the trash, and made their faces up with makeup and paint. He knew all of their names, their histories, and the circumstances of all of their deaths. He dug up the first body on the 9th of May in 2003 following the disagreement with his parents over adoption, instead deciding on resurrecting the deceased with his black magic. The coffin was covered with crimson synthetic material. With a chisel, I hollowed out a hole in the lid of the coffin at the head, and through it I pulled out what was left of the body. It was in very poor condition. The girl was dressed in a white blouse, black skirt, old tights and shoes. The child had long hair. Then I decided for the first time to try to mummify it. I moved the body to a remote corner of the cemetery and buried it in the abandoned grave with bags from them from grandmother. To properly mummify the body, you need soda and salt in various proportions. I bought these substances in the store. I found old stockings in the garbage dump and made bags from them, pouring soda and salt into them and tied them to the remains. I changed these bags once a week. If people paid attention to me, I said that I was there to feed the birds. On July 25th, 2003, I wrapped the body in different clothes and carried it back to my home in my backpack. Within 2 days, I restored the body. I stuffed rags inside, and then I sewed the body with threads and made a wax mask on her face, and then covered it with nail polish, which I found in the trash. After that, I put on her clothes, which I also found in the trash. Some of the dolls had buttons for eyes, whilst others had masks made from soft toys. Whilst in custody awaiting trial, Musk fitted with police investigations detailing the various cemeteries the bodies had been removed from, as well as supplying the names of the girls he had exhumed. On the 12th of May, he gave an interview to Russian journalists explaining how and why he had collected his dolls. The thing is, I'm practicing black magic. I wanted to revive them. I felt sorry for these children who could still live and live. I kept them so that when science learns to fight cancer, it can later revitalise them. Genetics are developing now very rapidly. I felt sorry for all these children. I am an expert in Celtic studies and studying Celtic culture. I noticed that the Druids had a tradition of communicating with the spirits of the deceased by sleeping on graves. When I studied the cultures of the peoples of Siberia, specifically the culture of the ancient Yakuts, there too I found a similar practice. I also began to sleep on the graves of the children who, like me, the spirits of the deceased children came to me. Accordingly, I checked whether it was demons that came or whether it was spirits. I collected all the information I could. Then, if possible, I checked this information. I was convinced that the spirits of the dead children really came to me. At first I slept on the graves, then I adjusted, because it was not convenient to sleep there. Instead I carried the bodies where it would be convenient for me to sleep on them. I began to dry them and bring them home. This was done very cleverly and slowly, one at a time, so nobody knew about it. I studied the theory, the technology of mummification from all available books. I studied the ancient Egyptian scripts. I went to Moscow specifically to study the whole thing. The journalists went on to ask him what he did with them whilst he kept them in his home. I talked with them. We had a hierarchy, our own language. We had, respectively, our songs. We had our own holidays. We had our own inner peace. My parents saw almost nothing of this, and I did not let anyone else into this world. As a rule, my parents left the house for summer, leaving in April and returning in October. At this time, we were engaged in this world. I guess I really explored all that I could explore in this area of black magic. To be honest, I had my favourite children. Those that I liked less, I planned to keep them in the garage. I did not disfigure them, I did not dismember them. I applied all of my work gently, affectionately, politely. I even tried not to swear in front of these children. The fact is that I suffered very much from loneliness, especially during the summer period when my parents were not there, and when they took the cat. I sat them down, they had holes drilled under their eyes. I showed cartoons to them. I played children's songs. I myself sang songs to them. Ordinary children's songs that I would sing when I have a live daughter. After that we ate together, or rather, I ate. I just offered them food, as it is in the Celtic or Yakut tradition. I have been studying child psychology for about 10 years, preparing for the upbringing of a child. I have experience of communicating with living children from my tutoring. What I would do with living children, I would do with these. I treated them as if they were alive. They were just temporarily dead. Moskvin spoke of how he held birthday parties for the children and celebrated special events with them. When a journalist asked if he knew that what he had done was illegal, he replied, "Yes, I realised that it was illegal. But at the time when the heroes of our science, Dubinin or Chetverikov, When they were experimenting with fruit flies somewhere in their closet, they also knew that it was illegal under the laws of Stalin's time. It was just then that genetics was banned. Now, cloning is prohibited. From the very beginning, I knew that I was committing a crime, but I was so sorry for the children that, unfortunately, cloning is prohibited in our country. It will be allowed sooner or later. I just wanted some material for future cloning, so that these children could live for a second time. I was very sorry for these children. Naturally, every time I dug a grave, I levelled it so that nothing could be seen, so as not to disturb those who were relatives. The fact is that for 10 years, this was kept secret, so I knew that none of the relatives of the deceased would ever know about this. I did everything neatly. I was not arrested in a cemetery. The MVD came to me on quite another matter, and accidentally they found the dolls. Nobody knew what I made these dolls from. Even my parents did not know. Terrifyingly, when asked why he did it all, he remarked that he wanted a child, a daughter of his own that he could share all of his knowledge with. The dolls were, for Moskvin, a twisted surrogate. The children that I liked, I dried, resurrected, and brought to my home. In May of 2012, the trial of Anatoly Moskvin began. Though he faced 5 years imprisonment, he was quickly deemed as insane and exempt from any criminal liability. A psychological evaluation diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, and on the 27th of September 2013, he was sentenced instead to compulsory medical measures. This essentially imprisoned him in a psychiatric clinic where his case is reviewed on a 6-monthly basis and could see him locked away for the rest of his life. During the trial, families of the girls he had mummified shouted out to the judge to imprison him for life, whilst others shouted for the death penalty. Eventually, neither prosecution nor defence appealed the outcome. He was ordered to pay compensation of up to $75,000 for moral damages to the families of each child, though interestingly, the father of one of Moskvin's dolls rejected any compensation. I would not take anything from Moskvin. After all, he treated my daughter better than I had during her life. He dressed her, put her to bed, read her fairy tales, and showed her cartoons. This split in opinion seen at the trial is one that echoes throughout Russia and remains until this day, shaping the current events surrounding Moskvin's incarceration. In June of 2015, Moskvin's usual hearing was to take place to extend his stay in the psychiatric hospital for a further 6 months. However, on this occasion, things went a little differently. As the hearing was in, the judge assumed all would go as it had previously, but this time, Moskvin had a new lawyer. Violetta Volkova, the same human rights lawyer who shot to international fame when she defended the feminist punk band Pussy Riot, openly speaking out against the Russian regime and judicial system. It had been reported that Moskvin had been beaten regularly by both guards and other patients, placed in isolation and not given freedom to leave his room, though his family may visit him daily. His mother claims he is fed up to 15 tablets a day, including many sedatives, leaving him unable to write, often dribbling on himself and sleeping for large portions of the day. Volkova gave new demands for Moskvin, insisting that he be transferred to an independent clinic in Moscow for re-examination, expressing distrust for the psychiatric doctors in Moskvin's current institution. Alongside Violetta, Moskvin has spent the last 2 years pressing for release and to continue his treatment at home as an outpatient. In 2018, this edged closer to reality as the case for release gained the backing of his current doctors. The hearing is due to take place on September the 27th. That's in 4 days' time for anyone listening to the podcast on its day of release. Whoever hired Volkova did so in some secrecy, though some have speculated it to be a TV station hoping to profit from the back of his release, whilst others have put forward theories of an arts group in Moscow or a human rights group. Despite this, and knowing full well of the poor treatment he had been given during his incarceration, his own parents do not wish for him to be released, fearing he would simply repeat his crimes. On the flip side, he appears to have met a future bride. an anonymous 25-year-old lady who studied at the same philological faculty he graduated from so many years ago. The fate bride. Moskvin's future is still up in the air, and his previous court hearings have suffered from several postponements. In fact, the hearing due in 4 days has itself already been rescheduled from its original date of the 12th of September, but it does appear that the tale of Anatoly Moskvin may soon turn a new page. If he is to be released, Moskvin has expressed interest in returning to work, translating written works in Moscow, and marrying his mystery bride. At least this time, his wife will be alive.